I love visiting the Polish countryside in spring, travelling along the smaller roads lined with storks' nests, fields of rapeseed glowing with neon vitality, and where you find the carefully maintained kapliczki, their brightly coloured ribbons flapping in the wind. Spring here is a gloriously sudden metamorphosis, when reality blooms hungrily, shedding the chrysalis of its long dark. So it's Majówka here in Poland, and most people are free from work, including myself, so I've taken the opportunity to come here to Marózek in warmińsko-mazurskie województwo to soak up some of the natural beauty. And I've taken a few books with me as well, and hopefully I'll have some time to get stuck into those and let you know how I get on over the course of a few days. I want to show you the lake that's just a few minutes down a forest path from where I'm staying. I'm hoping to be able to watch the sunset tonight, if there's a chance. I think it could be quite spectacular here. So, last night I vowed to myself that I'd get up extraordinarily early and have a long walk before breakfast. And I'm always doing that, making over-ambitious plans and then finding that I have no energy whatsoever when the time comes. But it's at about 8:30 now, about 9 o'clock. It's not so bad. One thing I did manage to do was a little bit more reading, and in some sense it feels really strange to discuss this particular book in this environment. I mean, look. It's peaceful, it's beautiful, it's about as far away from the horrors that I've been reading about as you can imagine. So I'm about halfway through, or just over halfway through Gordon Burns' Happy Like Murderers, the book about Fred and Rosemary West. And I have to say I'm absolutely blown away by it. It's unlike any reportage or non-fiction in general that I've read, style-wise, and feels far more ambitious than a lot of those kinds of books to me. And because it has an emphasis on style, I suppose. It's written a bit like an oral history, and the voice that Gordon Burn employs is quite malleable and insistent, such that as it gets closer to the particular figures that it's discussing, it will start to adopt the mannerisms of their own speech and bring you closer and closer to the sort of inner workings of their psyche through the voice. And when you're dealing with the kinds of people that Gordon Burn is writing about, that's quite a harrowing and unnerving experience. The second thing I think is absolutely incredible about it is its outward focus. So as much as it is interested in the horrific deeds that were committed by those two abusers and murderers is interested just as much, if not more, in the environment that created them, in looking at the space and the architecture and the labor and the modes of behavior that surrounded both Fred and Rosemary West and their victims. And it achieves this via a piling up of details about the materiality of life, objects, dress, interiors, details on the poetics of landscape and labor. And these details coalesce or congeal into a kind of miserable tableau of post-war England. For anyone not familiar with the West, though I imagine most are, they are some of the most notorious serial killers in the history of the country. When their crimes came to light, the remains of 12 victims were discovered, most buried in the cellar and back garden of their house at 25 Cromwell Street. Many showed evidence of torture and abuse prior to death.
The arrest of Fred West triggered one of the biggest police investigations in modern times. West was detained in late February last year with his wife by police investigating the disappearance of their 16-year-old daughter Heather, who was last seen alive in 1987. Shortly afterwards, police using digging equipment found Heather's remains in the back garden of number 25 Cromwell Street, Gloucester, an address that was to become known as the House of Horror. Within days, the remains of 2 more bodies had been found in the garden. More grim discoveries followed.
And this outward focus means that the book can't be simply sensationalist. It can't be an exercise in shocking its readers. It's far more concerned in looking at a broader picture of a culture of dysfunction. And so by starting at various points that are quite distant, in fact, from the main characters of the book, Fred and Rosemary West, for instance, the book begins several generations back in one of the victims' families, in Caroline Rain's family. And what is built up through this is this picture of generations of cultural dysfunction, of abuse, of alcoholism, of incest, of poverty and dreadful labor conditions. I think it doesn't do this in order to excuse anyone, but simply to show that this is one of the possible results of such conditions that were allowed to exist and very likely still exist in England. And it's a very deeply English book in some sense, but an England that most people don't think of, a sort of forgotten England. But for all its Englishness, some of the horrors with which the book deals, particularly about the rural community in which Fred West grew up, and in details of Caroline Rain's childhood in the Forest of Dean, put me in mind of certain popular American visions of isolated communities. At times the book resembles nothing so much as American folk horror. For instance, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. This idea of a place in the country that has existed in isolation for an extraordinarily long time and is just at just beyond the fingertips of officialdom, just outside any administrative power. This is what Fred's upbringing in Much Markle feels like. And when you add to it his experience in slaughterhouses that he would put to work on his victims deepens that analogy somehow. This is a book one needs some respite from, and so I try to soak in the landscape. In May here, it's still too cold to swim, but if you want, you can follow the narrow trail around the whole lake. You pass through spots where thick stands of reeds nod in the breeze, or swarm to choke a wooden jetty that clings to the banks of the lake. In the forest, the freshness of the colour green strikes you with the force of first things. The newly woken grass forms a soft bed on the forest floor, and by the shifting shades of green in the tree line, you can separate the old growth from the new, the replanted woods straining towards the sun, spots where the felling is very recent. Like I said, it's rather strange to be discussing it in an environment like this, but that is what I'm reading. So I've found myself at the Muzeum Budownictwa Ludowego, the ethnographic park in Olszynek, and it's a celebration of traditional forms of architecture, craft, and food, music and dance. It's quite something. The park gathers many objects from the region of East Prussia, which encompassed parts of northeastern Poland and Lithuania. There are traditional homes, barns and windmills. It has a gorgeously rebuilt 18th century Kościół Ewangelicki, or evangelical church, built of wood and thatch. Inside, the panelling is beautifully painted. My favourite was the exhibition of the traditional weaver Anna Bałdyga, whose intricate designs depicting monstrances, herbs, forests and animals adorn the whitewashed walls of a wood-built house. So I've been reading a little bit more of Happy Like Murderers by Gordon Byrne, and one thing that I think he's really good at doing is evoking the character of Fred West's obsessions. For instance, in the constant blurring of his private life and his professional life, and the tools that he would leave lying around in every domestic space that he occupied, and how they would mix themselves up with his dark sexual interests. Sex and work, work and sex, the two mutually contaminating, continually cross-feeding, this constant two-way current to the point where everything in Fred West's life became sexualized. There was always this blurring, always this confusion of uses between where he worked and where he lived. No matter how hard Rose worked at getting rid of them, the crowbars, the plumb lines, the sanders, the wheel braces, the lengths of hose and the drill bits kept creeping back. In another striking passage, an extended description of the job Fred West, typically an odd job man, held for the longest, becomes a bleak metaphor for the compulsive prurience that would be evident throughout his adult life. The name of Fred West's machine at the wagon works and his companion for 10 years was Power Thrust. He took his break on his bench at the machine, his morning lunch, and then it was just drilling holes all day. The big drill forcing the hole and going into the hole, bringing it down and penetrating the plate, plunging the drill through the metal and pulling out, minute after minute, in and out, day after day, out and in, power thrust. It was written on the side in polished letters. Asked to choose between friendly human presences and the companionship of objects, there was never any doubting what Fred was going to choose. He always preferred objects to people, the deadened and dehumanized over the alive and responding. That would be his choice every time. 10 years, just drilling holes. It never stopped. It didn't stop at all. There was no let-up. I visited Olszynek briefly, a sleeping, unprepossessing town. So sleepy, in fact, that when I visited a little antiques shop, the owner was outside having a nap in his car. I wandered the church grounds, which contained the obligatory monument to Jan Paweł II, this time cast in bronze and peering out from pendulous branches of weeping willow. I left the forest and the lakes behind the next morning, but I was happy that I did eventually get to catch that sunset I'd hoped for 2 nights ago. So I'm back in Warsaw now. It was wonderful to escape for a few days, but it's good to be back as well. Today is the 3rd of May, which is a national holiday here in Poland, 3 Maja. It's the celebration of the Constitution. But that means that, as you can hear, there's a lot going on in the city, and there are crowds all over the centre and so on, so I'm going to try and escape across the river for a little while, maybe find somewhere to read. So while I'm down in Praga, I think a quick stop at Antiquariat Grochowski is in order. It's a second-hand bookshop, and they quite often have plenty of books in English and in German, as well as huge collection in Polish, obviously. Let's go and see what they have. So it turns out that the bookshop was closed, as I probably should have known. But the owner was kind enough to let me in and have a look anyway. I didn't see too much of interest today, but I did pick up one handsome edition of Henry Miller's Plexus. So I'm about 3/4 of the way through Happy Like Murderers now, and I'm starting to understand why so many people I've spoken to had such a hard time getting through the book. It really does get a lot more harrowing and horrifying as it goes on, and particularly as it starts to focus more and more on the children and their life in the house at 25 Cromwell Street. Anne-Marie West seems to have borne the brunt, or got the worst of everything, being both her father's favourite and Rosemary's, and a source of Rosemary's jealousy, let's say. And some of the things that I've been reading about don't bear repeating here. But just the space in general, so the cellar where the bodies of 8 young girls were buried eventually, was also converted to be the children's bedroom for a time. And there's a description of how the youngest in the family, when surrounded by the familiar, friendly objects that we expect in children's rooms, but Fred's tools, Fred's collection of building tools and gardening tools, and even tools from a slaughterhouse, I think something used to remove the horns of bulls and so on. And you can imagine this young child waking up every morning to the jagged teeth of these industrial implements. It's difficult to keep going with this one, but I'm going to, because I admire what it's doing stylistically a lot, and I remain really impressed by Gordon Byrne's writing, and I'll certainly be looking into more of his work. I know his novel Alma Kogan is supposed to be incredible, so we'll see. I'll let you know my final thoughts when I finish it. I have to say though, there's really nothing like reading outside on a spring day. It's one of the things that's making the book bearable. So on the way home from work today, I finished Gordon Byrne's Happy Like Murderers. And I was reflecting that in one of my previous videos, a Q&A video, somebody asked me what the most disturbing book I'd ever read was, and if I were answering that now, this would definitely take the number one spot. I mean, it contains some of the most awful things I've ever read about. Some of the most awful things that can happen to a human being, I think. And there was a point last night when the book really upset me, and I questioned once again whether I was going to continue with it. And it was a moment very close to the end that describes how after the abuse, some of the abuse of one of the daughters came to light, and that Rosemary and Fred West were actually prosecuted for it. They managed to get themselves acquitted purely because their emotional grip on the family was so tight and so powerful that they convinced everyone to take back the accusations that they'd made, and both Fred and Rosemary West walked free initially. Of course, we know that later discoveries were made about the murders, and everything came out eventually, but that idea that you can be so deep in someone's thrall that they can do absolutely anything to you is just such a harrowing thought. Indeed, the events were so heinous that it's easy to understand why the community and maybe England wanted to try and forget about them altogether. In describing what happened to the house at 25 Cromwell Street, Gordon Byrne writes this. He says, "The demolition was a full media event, a public spectacle that Gloucester Council, who organised it, hoped would have a cleansing effect on the city. There was a consensus about demolition, obliteration. The feeling was that people wanted to see the site made anonymous and ordinary." And I think I can understand now why Benjamin Myers, in his introduction to the edition I've got, says this of the book. He writes, "What you hold in your hands is not merely a book, it is a haunted object, a litany of disgust." And that is true, but I really want to stress that this is by no means a work of gory sensationalism. I think it's something far more important than that. It's an ambitious and creative and highly unique analysis of what human beings are capable of, and a study of the genesis of evil in environments of extreme dysfunction. It's like, as I was saying in my initial comments on the book, it's really the book's outward focus, its expansiveness that recommends it, and I certainly do recommend it, but only to people who have a particularly strong resistance to those darker aspects of life, because some of the material within it is truly challenging. At least I found it so. But give it a go at your peril. In other news, I received my latest Rick Brick in the form of Margie and the Atomic Brain. This is Zachary Tanner's latest novel. I read his earlier work, Oscar Submerges, with enormous pleasure, and so I'm hoping to find just as much in this one eventually. But it's not the next thing I'll be reading. I already have that lined up, so once I've started it, we'll talk again. It's Sunday, and I'm leaving the city again to visit a place I first saw around 7 years ago. So right now it's the 7th of May, it's a Sunday, and I'm in the forest near a town called Otwock, which is about 14 miles south of Warsaw. I was hoping for it to be a nice sunny day, but unfortunately no luck this weekend. But I've taken you here because I want to show you something really cool, and I think it fits somehow with the author that I've just begun reading. I remember having a bit of a hard time finding it last time as well, but eventually stumbling upon it, so hopefully we'll be lucky this time as well. Okay, so here it is. These are the ruins of the hospital or sanatorium Zofiówka, officially Zakład dla nerwowo i psychicznie chorych Żydów, institution for nervously and mentally ill Jews, built in 1907. Under Nazi occupation, 400 patients were intentionally starved to death here. It struck me that this is the kind of place the author I'm reading right now might write about. A ruined place on the edge of town, where horrible things occur and teenagers visit after sneaking out at night, daring each other to enter. The building is also the site of the disturbing viral video 11BX1371, which is where I first heard about it. On my first visit, the light was better, and I took some photographs. So right now I'm in the middle of B.R. Yeager's new book, Burn You the Fuck Alive, which came out just this week, in fact. And I'd enjoyed his previous work, 2 novels, Amygdalatropolis and Negative Space, so much that I decided to snap it up immediately. And this is a collection of stories, his debut collection of stories, I believe. And if I was looking for some kind of respite from the darkness of Gordon Burns' Happy Like Murderers, this was perhaps not the best book to choose, but I'm still getting an awful lot out of it, nevertheless. And a few stories in it have really stood out for me. So towards the beginning, it feels like many of the stories are preoccupied by the psychological and social problems that emerged as a result of the pandemic, and they focus on remote work. And one of them in particular really left an impression on me. It's called The Young People, and it's about a couple who are attempting to reinvigorate their sex lives and find that the only way to do that involves quite an extreme act that I won't go into here. But another thing I really like about B.R. Yeager's writing is that he's able to shift between, or sort of modulate between different registers, a very casual register, and he'll suddenly accelerate at certain moments into a high lyricism, and a very kind of angular, violent sort of lyricism with really striking and sometimes ugly imagery, but it can be extraordinarily powerful. And in that story, the young people, at the climax of the story, it almost turns into a kind of prose poem. I was really impressed by that. So the story that I'm reading right now has an amazing title. It's called In the Shadow of Penis House, and it brings to the fore some of that formal experimentalism that I enjoyed so much about Amygdalatropolis, but which was less evident in Negative Space. And the story is made up of a kind of patchwork of indeterminate forms of text that sort of hang together and echo one another. There are also stories that are more straightforwardly horror stories, like The Buried Man. And B.R. Yeager is excellent at doing this too, if he wants to. And others mix erotica and horror, such as Poison Nurse, which again deals with some extraordinarily dark subject matter, but with a sort of absurd, surrealist twist. So lots and lots to recommend about this collection so far. When I've finished it, and I soon will, I'm reading it quite quickly, I'll let you know what I think. It's good to come back to this place again. The last time I was here was about 7 years ago or so, perhaps a little bit more, but it still has that quite overwhelming atmosphere, this kind of mournful silence. But I'm going to head back to Warsaw now. So there's another place of more specifically literary significance in Otwock that I wanted to show you. I couldn't find it for a long time on the internet, but I asked a nice lady here who directed me towards it. Let's hope we can track it down. So unfortunately it looks to be closed today. I'm not sure if it's open on other days. I mean, today is a Sunday, but behind me here is the place where Władysław Reymont, the Nobel Prize winner for literature, Polish writer, completed the fourth part of his epic novel of country life, The Peasants, or Chłopi, as it's known in Polish. In a future video, I'm going to be talking at length about... Let's wait for this cars to go past. I'm going to be talking about that book at length in a video at some point in the future, so hopefully we'll have occasion to come back here at some point. So I've had a few new books arrive this week, and I thought I'd show you. The first is Solenoid by Cărtărescu, and it seems that this novel has received pretty much universal praise all round. I know that Chris from Leaf by Leaf and Sean of Travel Through Stories and Seth, Waste Mailing List, all seem to be enamoured with it. There's one notable exception in Ben, Bookshaw Ben, who isn't quite convinced. So I'm eager to find out for myself and see what I make of it. But I'm very intrigued. So that's the first one. And the other book that arrived this week is Hit Parade of Tears by Izumi Suzuki. Oh, my cat's running around. Who seems like a fascinating figure. She's a Japanese writer. She writes science fiction short stories, and this is the second collection put out by Verso Books. I have the first one here as well, Terminal Boredom, which I also haven't got to yet, but I really hope to soon. But they're quite pretty editions, quite handsome. They make a nice little pairing, so hopefully I'll get to these very soon. Anyway, that's it for now. Oh, my cat's come to join us. Cześć Lea. Jak tam? No i co? Jesteście głodne, tak? Jedzenie już było. So it's the 10th of May today, and yesterday I finished reading B.R. Yeager's Burn You the Fuck Alive. And I have to say I really enjoyed the collection as a whole. And I found it really interesting structurally and perhaps quite unique in that it contains quite a number of longer stories that are written in a more conventional narrative mode. But those longer pieces are interspersed with slightly more fragmentary, cryptic, shorter pieces of prose that feel a lot more enigmatic and suggestive. And it's the sort of cumulative atmospheric resonance of the two forms that makes the collection particularly compelling. Or for me it did. And something also about B.R. Yeager's preoccupations and style. The stories quite often feel like a kind of metaphorical extrapolation of an interior state. So he might take something like depression or isolation or sexual frustration, or even the feeling of being worn down by continuous labor, and give it a kind of expression that takes it to its most extreme point in the real world, and that's how the story will be formed. That's true of the young people, I think, but also of one of the stronger pieces towards the end of the collection, Highway Wars, which ended up being one of my favourites, but particularly the first half of that story. But yeah, I recommend it very much. I think B.R. Yeager's someone that I'm going to continue to follow as he produces more work. I'm really interested to see where he goes and what he does. And the publisher, Apocalypse Party in general, are putting out some really interesting work lately. So if you're not aware of them, then try to follow them on social media or look into what they're putting out, because it's some really interesting writing, I think. So I'm going to be ending my little reading diary there, I think. And this was a bit of an experiment for me. So let me know if you enjoyed it, if you'd like me to do something like this again. I've enjoyed making it, but yeah, it does feel distinctly experimental. But before I end, I did just want to let you know what I'm reading next. And in fact, I'm about 50 pages into this already. I chose to finally give Solenoid a go, and I'm absolutely loving it so far. And I feel slightly mocked in quite how ludicrously relatable this is so far. I think that's probably a bad thing that it is, but it has really made me laugh out loud quite a number of times. But I also think it's really beautiful. So the evocation of 1970s Bucharest is quite magnificent. I think I'm so intrigued to see where it's going, and I've got a feeling this is going to be a good one for me. So we'll see. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video at all, please consider subscribing to the channel. It really means a lot to me. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.